Hey, everybody. Welcome to the 27th episode of Axioms on Trial. We got another awesome episode. This will be a discussion one. We're kind of kicking back into gear for the discussion with the opposition, so to speak. And hopefully, I think that's typically, I don't know, Cease, what do you think? You think that's probably more of what people want to see anyway? Or like, what would be your guess on that?
I don't know. I think people probably prefer. I think people prefer a variety. I think they like to see different kinds of stuff, not just one thing all the time. So
exactly, yeah, I would agree. Yeah. Well, so we'll I guess we'll kick into it early. I have a couple things I do want to say. One, quickly, especially since Abdullah helped a lot with the video. The discussion we had with him. That's the most viewed video we've had. We're approaching over like 1,000 views on that. And I had been doing some stuff, against Islamic apologetics as well. And as a result of such, I have lost my monetization on TikTok for doing, I guess, too many videos on Islam, which was never a problem for content against Christianity or the spiritual community or witch talk or whatever it might be, but it was a problem in the Islamic religious community, apparently, for me to make those types of videos. And I just wanted to point out that the criticism there, it needs to be handled better, and we need to be able to have these discussions and conversations without somebody having to lash out and just mass ban you, because if that happened on this show, which is something I care way more about than a TikTok, that would make me very, very upset. And not just the monetization part, but just the fact that we got to restart again. And long ramble cut short. Let's not block these types of conversations. These are good conversations to have. But yeah, Cease, anyway, let me get off my soapbox and I'll.
Well, let me just add to that.
Sure.
I don't care who tries to silence us. We're gonna keep going regardless. So if they want to act like cowards and try to stifle the conversation and cry Islamophobia just because we're trying to have a discussion, they can try it. But I'm never gonna stop doing what I think is right. So.
Yeah, and it's a good point to add there. But yeah, let's go ahead and add our guest in. We got I was actually supposed to have a conversation with him. I'm pretty sure I messed this up, and maybe Bryan can come in and fill in the details on what happened. But we'll have him come in and have him detail kind of his background and what he thinks most is important for the audience to know as well. But Bryan, thank you for coming on. And with that said, just give us a little background on yourself and what you think's necessary for the audience to know.
Yeah. Well, so thanks, guys. I really appreciate y'all having me. It's been, I love to just talk about these sort of things. It's a passion of mine. And interestingly enough, it's actually hard to talk about belief in a free-flowing way among theists. And so it's going to be a privilege to be able to do this. I am a Christian pastor. I in a church here in Texas, and I have grown up Christian, but I went through some deconstruction as I went into my education, found out a lot of the things that I was taught about Christianity were not true. And in that process of deconstruction, I reconstructed into something that I still call Christianity. If you wanted to, we were talking about labels earlier before we started, and if you wanted to put I thought about it a little bit. If you wanted to put like a label on my position, I would call myself the best way I can describe it is kind of an existential Christian theist, and that's it's a very specific brand of theism. But I would definitely still call it theism. I got 2 kids, and love them to death. And my biggest passion is trying to help people articulate things about meaning and purpose in life. And so that's kind of where I come from in all this.
Cool. You mentioned that you realized that you were being taught some things about Christianity that were false. I'm curious to know what you're referring to there.
Well, so interestingly enough, if we were going to have conversations with like fundamentalists or or I would even say maybe like mainstream evangelicals, in terms of the atheism, theism positions. I would probably be on your side more than their side, on most topics. There's one of the greatest theologians of the 20th century, Paul Tillich, huge influential thinker. He said this, that atheism is actually closer to the biblical tradition than theism, because they both treat God as an object, something, and atheism denies the object when theism defines the object, and the biblical tradition says it's not an object. It's a wonderful little thing that he says. It's a hugely influential dude. But in terms of the particularities, things about like, Genesis 1, for example, I was taught was kind of a, and you guys might have this misconception too. So I'll share this. So sometimes we talk about the creation accounts, how Christians talk about the creation account, as if this was a primitive explanation of the natural world, of biodiversity, of all these sorts of things. But when you learn the background of the text and how it's put together, it's clear that wasn't even its intention when it was written. This is a poetic polemic against the god of Marduk, and I could go into the exegetical thing of how we know that. But if you look at how Genesis 1 is put together, Genesis 1 is right next to Genesis 2, and these are two contradictory poetic accounts of creation. And so it's like the author is begging us not to take them literally, like it's like literally that's what's happening. And so some things like that, where these things that were given to me as fact were challenged and pushed on in my Christian education, and having to deconstruct the faith that I had was a painful process, and that's where a lot of people end. That's where a lot of people end their journey with faith. It's like something like a 35% of all seminarians lose faith, and so it's a difficult process of putting something back together that is tenable through that. It's a very difficult thing. I could go more into that if you want.
Yeah, well, I actually wanted to cut in because what you said there, I think is and then maybe hopefully sideline this and have you and see start at the one-on-one. Sure. But what you said there, I think, is actually fair, especially when you mentioned with the Genesis part about this might be a misconception you have, because I would just go ahead and concede to you that what you're saying there is probably what you are going to take as the misconception. I am going to probably be on that side of what you think is that. And so I'm actually doing a debate on the 29th on TART, kind of in regards to, does the Christian God exist? And I do take the aspect of Genesis literally. We had Professor Dave on, who has a YouTube channel. I don't know if you're familiar. He's got like 1 million subscribers, so he's pretty big. But he even says, as somebody who's an atheist, that clearly this is metaphorical. Clearly this is not that. And so I take a minority. I disagree with like Dave, or I don't know Cease's position on this or other. I disagree. I think it is pretty definitive claim on that, but like I'm very open to hearing like your position on that. Yeah. So at the end of this, if you would want to have that be our one-on-one for like the remainder of the time, that might be a cool thing that we could get into.
I can give you just a short like little snippet of what that is. I can do it in a few seconds. I think that kind of demonstrates why I think that's not the case.
Yeah, do that, and then you and Cease can get into the one-on-one. Yeah. And I'll try to like touch back. I'll write that down, and at the end, I'll touch back on a comment on that.
Yeah. So Genesis as a book gets put together. It's a whole bunch of different sources. It's that spans centuries, and it gets put together in the form that it is, probably in Babylonian captivity. And what happens is when you put Genesis 1 in conversation with the Babylonian myth, it makes very clear claims and clear contrasts between Marduk and Yahweh, or Elohim, as he's called in Genesis chapter 1. And so things like the formless void, the watery formless void in Genesis chapter 1, verses 1 and 2, being split by words, contrasts with the watery sea monster of Marduk, of Tiamat, that Marduk kills and splits. There's all these sorts of narrative conversations going on in this. And so what it really is functioning as in the text, I think demonstrably, is a poetic polemic against the god of the chief god of Babylon. And so we can talk about that more later, but I think that's when you examine the text and put it in conversation with the texts that it would be in conversation with, I think you can demonstrate that quite clearly.
Sure. Yeah. And I actually would love to maybe we could go into a brief thing if we have time, and then maybe that be the precursor into what me and you have in our one-on-one. But I want to go ahead and give the floor to you and Cease. Sure. I'm going to bow out. I've had a couple people ask when I'll do more of a one-on-one here. I've had a lot of things go on that I got to book some things. Cease has been killing it with booking people. And so I'm needing to catch up. And when I catch up and I do that, I'll have some guests on here. But Cease at the moment is making Axioms a hot oiled machine right now. But I will back out, let you guys have the conversation, and hopefully we can touch upon that.
So let me just comment on what you said there briefly.
Sure.
Because I personally, like my standpoint is I have no opinion on what I think how the Bible should be read. Obviously, I prefer, if I'm gonna have an opinion, I prefer the more metaphorical reading of it, because I think it's less absurd than the clearly false literalist approach. So
sure.
I take the metaphorical approach more seriously, and I think it's a more in-depth approach to it. Mm-hmm. That said, I think the problem that I see is that most people who call themselves Christian or Muslim don't have that approach.
Yeah, so I think this is a great way to segue into the idea about what we're talking about when we talk about God. Because a lot of people, when people have this conversation, they assume that generally they're talking about the same thing, and there usually several different things going on. One of my favorite theologians, Pete Rollins, has some categories that kind of help us unpack what's happening existentially and linguistically when we talk about God. And so one of them is exactly what you're talking about, right? So one of the first one is God as a super being, that, we're strong, he's omnipotent. We're smart, he's omniscient. He's a being, he's an object that is everything we wish we could be, right? That's Feuerbach. I don't know if you're familiar with Feuerbach from philosophy. 19th century.
The name sounds familiar. Yeah.
Yeah. So his big critique of God was that God is man writ large. Karl Barth picks this up in the 20th century. He's a theologian who says that a lot of times when we talk about God, what we're doing is we're talking about ourselves with a megaphone. Right. And so this idea about God as this super being, this grand object that we use to justify ourself, our morals, our legitimizes us, condemns our enemies. This is one way that people talk about God. The problem is, especially when it comes, and this is why I would, if that's what we're talking about when we're talking about God, right? I would be an atheist to that God. Now, there are other modes of talking about God. One is the next one he talks about is hyperbeing, and so what he means by that is this would be closest to the Orthodox Christian position, that God is that which is ultimate but indescribable, and so to talk about this God is to not talk about this God. So any system or language that you use to describe this thing is ultimately flawed and wrong. You nominate it and then simultaneously denominate it. Right. And so It's you name the unnamable, and you play in the midst of that. You kind of see this with the name of God in Hebrew. When God reveals his name to Moses in Exodus chapter 3, in that story, the word there, we say Yahweh, but if you read it as it's written, it's impronounceable. You can't even actually say the name. And so God is that which is beyond description. One of my favorite illustrations of this in Christian tradition, if you look behind me, you can see I have all sorts of images. I've got images that speak to me. You got the cross, you got some icons. You also have Superman and Batman. I don't know if you can see those as well. But these are images that speak to me. One of the things that they do is, instead of having these ornate icons or statues, their icon for God was a hole in the wall, where they would kind of say that anything that we can make would not describe this, whatever God is. And that, I think, is closer to what the Orthodox Christian articulation of God actually is. And so there's more to talk about that. I just want to give you, I've been talking for a really long time. I just want to give you a chance to respond or think about that.
No, that's fine. So I'm a little bit trying to think of how to approach this, because on one hand, I have no problem with what you're saying, in the sense that I actually apply the same idea to reality in general. Like,
yes, that's good. Yes.
So I don't believe that, I've said this on the show before, is that there's always a gap between the description and the thing itself.
Yes.
There's always going to be some leftover that we're not capturing fully. And that's not to say that we can't say anything about reality. Like, we can describe it. It's just that we are aware that our description is flawed and limited.
Yes.
My problem with sort of defining it this way as completely indescribable is that then how are we making any kind of epistemic claims about its existence, about what it wants? Like, there seems to be, if you want to say that there's things beyond our understanding, of course there are. But then to then say, try to construct, I mean, at that point, why not just say there are open questions, as opposed to, no, I'm a Christian who believes in X, Y, and Z.
Well, so I think what you're describing is why man, it's hard to build this without laying the groundwork for all of this. Your intuition, I think, is right on the money, because I think ultimately at its core, and this is something that Catholics would disagree with, but I think they, and lots of evangelicals really, but that even for Christianity, dogma is the enemy. And Kierkegaard gets at this, right? So Kierkegaard says that he wants to become a Christian within Christendom. Like, he lives, in Sweden, where everybody's Christian anyway at that point. And so, but he says, yeah, but they're not getting it. He says they're caught up playing the wrong game, and he wants to play a little bit of a different game. And I think this idea of nominating and denominating as a constant cycle of knowing and unknowing is baked into, I think, Christian theology. And now I'm not saying that that's the only place you can have that, but as Christian theology functions, I think that's baked into it. And so what you're saying, your question, right, is why, if we're going to talk about these descriptors and their utility, whether or not they're true in any sort of Cartesian sense, then why even hold to any sort of religious system? Is that kind of your...
Yeah, in any kind of denomination. I mean, you mentioned Kierkegaard. He's a fascinating philosopher. I appreciate some of his approach to the questions, for sure, even though, ultimately I probably don't agree with most of what he says, but I do find them quite interesting. I had a seminar on him about a year or so ago. So he's a interesting character for sure.
Yeah. So I think this might. I mean, so how do we talk about this? This is a difficult thing to talk about because you're. Okay, so I think I have a way to approach this. So, there was a French philosopher and psychoanalyst, last name, what's her last name? Lacan.
Yeah.
And the way that Lacan talks about human existence is we conceive of things in 3 different ways. One is the imaginary. So the imaginary is kind of like in the fairy tale where you have the knight killing the dragon and saving the princess or getting the gold. It's the images in the fairy tale, and I think that lines up really well with this idea of super being or God as object. It's the image. It's the thing. But then Lacan says that you have under that, and I think under that's the right way to describe it, under that, the symbolic. And the symbolic is the systems of the world that the images are kind of getting at. Like, the dragon and the knight story is, rooted in this idea that there are real evils in the world and we need to fight these evils. It'd be like the myth of redemptive violence or something like that. This symbolic substrate that the images kind of embody. And then you have the real, is what Lacan calls the real. And the real is what breaks those things up. So the real is, you might think the world works a certain way, that if you put in your work and you go to school and you get a decent paying job, that your life is going to go great, and then your business falls out from under you and all of a sudden the real hits you. Like the way that you thought the world works falls apart. And so for Lacan, these things exist in all at once, all at the same time. We live in those. There's really no escaping living within those things. And so for me, when we talk about God and we talk about religious systems, sometimes we're talking about images, right? Sometimes we're talking about these things. Sometimes we're talking about the symbols. But what I think Christianity does, I wouldn't say uniquely, but what I think Christianity does is, and we can talk about this in more detail here in a moment, but I want to give you a chance to respond to this, make sure we're tracking all at the same time. But what Christianity does is that Christianity functions, or at least it did when it hit the scene, as the real that breaks worldview. Like the cross is an inherently kind of nihilistic critique of religion itself. And so we can talk more about that here in a minute, but I want to make sure that we're all on the same page. I keep talking quite a bit.
No, you're fine. No, this is your time.
Sure.
So a few thoughts that popped into my head right away is it is precisely the lack of methodology from the religious perspective to separate, to differentiate between the imaginary and the real that I have a problem with. From my perspective, regardless of whether you want to interpret the religious worldview through literalist lens or a metaphorical one or a combination of the two, I don't see the tools to be able to ground these ideas as anything more than imaginary or symbolic that don't relate to something that's actually concrete that we can. I mean, science, with its problems and flaws, seems to be able to at least do that to a degree.
Yeah. So this kind of how I'd respond to that is, I actually would say that the same critique applies to us, to our experience of meaning in the world. So if we're going to experience something as deeply meaningful, I would challenge that we cannot set. So let's take Lacan's words and put them in some more analytical philosophy. Analytical philosophy is not my forte. I like continental philosophy much more, but I'll try and put it in a little bit. So we have.
I appreciate the rigor of analytic, but I would say I'm probably more in the continent. I mean, a weird in between, actually.
Yeah. So, how do I put this? It's hard. So,
by the way, can I just say one thing before I forget?
Yeah, go ahead. Sure.
Because you mentioned Lacan, my thesis is on postmodernism.
We're going to have a lot to talk about because my theology is postmodern. So,
that's going to be an interesting discussion because I'm definitely very critical of that whole approach to things. So we should get into that.
Yeah.
But go ahead.
When we talk about, let's say, like, when I say something like, my kid is the most beautiful kid in the world. When I make that statement, there is the object, my kid. And in this sense, the object would function as the image. This is the particular instantiation of a thing. And that objective element is there. Now, is my kid the most beautiful kid in the world, the most wonderful kid in the world? No. Like, that's not objectively true. But through my subjectivity, I find meaning in it, and I cannot deny that I find meaning in it, and that it affects me in that way. And so you have the objective, then you have the subjective element, and then you have, I think, what I would call like the transformative element. So like that kid becomes a source of life and light and purpose in my life. And what happens is if you try and pick those things apart, the whole notion falls apart. It's only by holding those things together that I think it has any function.
Okay, so that's an interesting approach. I would say I disagree with that conclusion. Because I think the how do I do this? I was always trying to go into postmodernism. Let me try to frame it this way. The claim that, like the top sentence, my son is the most beautiful kid in the world, I don't think is really analogous to what is meant by meaning in the general existential context. What I mean by this is, I think while recognizing that there is not some objective meaning given to me, that it arises from purely my existence.
From your experience, yes.
But none of that implies the need to believe anything with insufficient reasons or evidence, or something that we know is objectively not the case, but we somehow spin it to the right side. Like, all I mean by meaning and purpose is the kind of state of being that I arrive at through engaging in what I am passionate about. And I consider that kind of state is something like comparable to a state like hunger or thirst or anything that we can phenomenologically talk about as, even if, and I agree with you, where I agree with the postmodernist is that language is ambiguous, and that we shouldn't have a naive belief in our ability to connect to reality in this sort of one-to-one ratio.
Mm-hmm.
So as long as in the beginning the postmodernists were approaching the question of truth in a skeptical way, let's not assume that we have it.
Yeah.
Okay, then they, from my perspective, they go completely off the rails to undermine, at least, I know not everybody interprets it that way, but many do, especially nowadays. Or many postmodernists will say things like, there's no such thing as truth or objective truth.
Yeah, so
anything is a construction.
I would disagree. Well, I think everything is a construction, but that doesn't mean that there's not something out there, right? So like Derrida, for instance, when Derrida talks about every time we construct something that we talk about as justice, our construction fails to be just. But I think this is a legitimate critique of postmodern thought, and people are talking about what this might be. They postmodernism, metamodernism, who knows?
It's not really even an organized movement anyway.
Right, right.
So it's hard to even.
And so what we would say is, all of our constructions might fall short of justice, but justice is this thing that calls to us, that we continue to pursue. We continue to critique our own constructs. And for me, that's the real, right? That is the real. And so I don't know if that maps onto what you're talking about.
I get what you're, I mean, I understand the perspective. I don't agree with it, I would say. Like, I think there are certain things that are constructed, which doesn't necessarily mean they're completely illusory. Like, there are reasons why we construct these things.
That's right, yeah.
I wouldn't say that everything is a construction. I think that's demonstrably...
I disagree. You'll have to paint that for me, because sure. As soon as we're talking about human language, we're talking about construction, right? As soon as we're talking about human logic itself is a construction, and because I don't think. Do you believe that logic is descriptive or prescriptive?
So I think it's descriptive.
Okay, so you. Okay, go ahead.
So I'll clarify. Yes, the tool of logic, in a sense, is constructed,
right? But
not in the same way, not arbitrarily. Like it arises. It arises from our phenomenological experience. So we observe a consistency to reality mm-hmm. that is real, that is actually self-evidently what we're experiencing. And then we construct a kind of set of rules in the scriptures to try to capture and generalize these experiences.
Right. Go. Sorry. I'm talking.
Sorry. No. Just the last thing I'll say is, so the tool may be the logic may be in a sense a construction,
right?
But it's not.
It's not an illusion.
But it's also not from nothing. It is capturing something that is there before the construction.
That's right. I completely agree about that. And that's also what I would say is the difference between, how do I put this? For me personally, that's the difference between me as a theist and an atheist. So for me, the constructions, which are religious systems, are all describing something that exists existentially, that we experience. And it is the denial of those things as true that becomes orthodoxly Christian. We can talk about that more here in a minute, but
that's interesting. I guess what I would say to that is there's nothing. I guess I would ask you to elaborate on what you think these existential experiences, because you were trying to make an analogy between sort of the tool of logic in regards to describing reality, and sort of these tools of theism that can be used to describe a certain kind of experience.
Yeah, I think that. So, I'm sorry. Go ahead.
No, go ahead.
So I think we talk about logic, and it's kind of ironic. Theology is a type of logic. It is a logic about God, theos, logos. But I even think that's probably an inappropriate term. I could talk in more in terms of theopoetics, because what you're doing is art. Anytime you're talking about God, and so that's kind of one of the things that I would look at. One of the things I think might help our conversation is talking about faith and belief.
Yeah.
Because I think that most Christians even have a bad idea of what belief actually is, and what biblical faith is, which I think are two different conversations. But one of the things I think that people mistakenly operate under is the assumption that we believe what we think we believe, or that we believe what we say we believe. Are you tracking with that, or do I need to explain?
No. I would explain more.
Yeah. So, a lot of what we say we believe is protecting ourselves, and we've just kind of, from psychology and psychoanalysis, we've learned about this. And so, like, if you ask a kid, maybe a kid whose parents aren't super great, what do you think of your daddy? Is he loving? Does he take care of you? And they're like, oh yeah, I love my daddy. But if you ask the teddy bear, well, what does teddy bear think of daddy? They'll say, oh, daddy's mean. Daddy hurts me. That sort of thing. We construct beliefs to protect ourselves. And I think religion often functions in that way, right? That right. It is a mechanism that we use to keep us from encountering the world. So this happens in all sorts of them. This is something you might be able to use against fundamentalists when you talk about them. I think that fundamentalism is only possible through unbelief, and I'll talk about that a little bit more here in a second. But this idea that one of the things I have a problem with the atheist critique of fundamentalism is I think it's ultimately impotent, because the atheist critique of fundamentalism is basically your standard of evidence are garbage. That's the critique, right? And it's you're believing too easily. But for the fundamentalists, that's the fantasy. That's what they want. Their notion of faith is I'm going to believe things super hard, regardless of whether or not there's good reasons for it, because that's what they feel like faith is. And so the atheist critique of fundamentalism, I think, is ultimately impotent. What I like to do when I talk to fundamentalists to try and really get at them is talk about things how what really sustains their belief is their disavowed unbelief. So, for example, take like, a lot of fundamentalists will say, well, if you'll just pray and give and be a good person, then God's going to take care of everything. But the disavowed unbelief is, except if your kid is really sick, then call an ambulance, right? They have the stated belief, but it's sustained by a kind of unconscious unbelief. And so there is this tension that keeps the belief alive. Like it's the fundamentalists who leave who are the ones who really, really believe that, right? Like their kid dies, they don't take him to the hospital, and everything falls apart. Right. The real hits their symbolic and imaginary, and they can't hold the system anymore. It's by having this kind of disavowed unbelief that they're able to kind of sustain the surface level.
Well, before I forget, let me just deal with that real quick, because I think while I appreciate to some degree psychoanalysis, I'm also generally skeptical of moving too far into the speculative realm, which is always
sure, it's not scientific. It's not scientific.
So I can actually agree with, I think what you're saying makes sense, and I think it's true for a number of people that they create this ideology that's more about comfort than anything else, and they're inconsistent in it. And I have observed that.
Yeah.
Right. There are also those who I think really it is about a standard of evidence, to where they believe they know they have the truth. Their evidence is their experience, what they think is their experience and what it suggests. And that not when their child dies, it's not going to shake their ideology. They're going to say, well, this was God's will. This is what was intended. And it's not going to shake my faith one iota. That is a pure dogmatic,
Well, and I think, go ahead. Sorry.
So the other thing is, I think it's important to sort of, because you mentioned when you're doing religion, you're really doing art.
Yes.
Okay. And I think there is a level to which art can reveal some truth about humanity, sort of in a metaphorical and psychological way. But I think it's important to sort of, how do I say this? Laser in on what it is that we're referring to when we're talking about the question of God. Because if what you're talking about is how to say this? It's one thing to talk about reality independent of us. Like what is the state of affairs to reality? Is there a being? Is there not a being? Is there a purpose? Is there not a purpose? If you want to move away from that to a more what's the word I'm looking for? Introspective way about our nature and what it is that we're deriving when we sort of play into these myth stories on an existential level. What it is that we're really doing is the sort of the metaphorical stories that we engage in, a way to sort of try to understand our place in the cosmos. Something like I'm not saying that that's necessarily what you're saying, but just as an idea. Then we can talk about these things on a more psychological level, in a way that's more tuned in to the individual rather than externalist claims.
Yeah,
so I would have less of an issue with religion in that context. The same way that I would look at art as something that is on itself a context of truth. Like the painting is not necessarily referencing a true thing, but it's capturing something that's sort of in between the lines.
So I think this might be a good time to return to these things about what we're talking about when we talk about God, because there's four that Rawlins talks about, and we talked about the first two: super being, this God as object; hyper being, as in when we speak about God, we're not speaking about God; and then there's God as ground of being, which is so we talked about God as object. Before. This would be the God is what comes before subject and object. And so this is kind of what you're talking about, right? That reality before reality that we don't actually perceive as it is. That this would be God as ground of being. And what I would say is, as we're moving through these four, they go from more theistic to more atheistic.
Right.
And the idea of ground of being is, it's kind of like how do I put this? God is that from which everything arises. And so like when you're just walking down the street, you pass people, and if you're just going about your day, they're there, you acknowledge them, but we have a lot of cows here in Texas, and it's a lot like cows looking at cars. Like you see them, but you don't really see them. And it is the thing that makes them come alive, that makes you see them not just in their in that dull, lifeless way, but see them as subject, is what I would call what Rollins would call this God as ground of being, and I would go on further to say that it is. Well, this might be too much to bring up right now. It might throw a whole wrench in the conversation, but I'll bring it up anyway because it is what I mean. It's the love of another that brings their subjectivity to life, and so, like when you go through a drive-through, the person at the who's passing out your food, they're a function. They serve a form. They're not. You don't see them in who they are, and so for this one, this ground of being, the thing from which everything that comes into being is even at this point would be almost like a process that we're engaged in, that we continually bring people into subjectivity. The Christian words for this is people are made in the image of God. That's the Christian conception of this idea that we see people not as object but as subject. And so I think what you're talking about as, if we're going to talk about God as reality beyond that doesn't break into our experience, but that allows us to experience, that would be this conception, I think.
It's strange. It's almost, I don't know. I'm trying to think of how to phrase this. How do I say this?
It's really hard. I don't. It's hard.
What I don't understand is the need to sort of hold on to this linguistic baggage. Like, why call that God? Or again, it comes back to if we can't describe it, then what are we saying? Because I can understand philosophically this idea of the other, our experience of the other, our gaze onto the other. You mentioned Derrida. What I first thought of when you talked about our coming to the experience of the other is Levinas.
Yeah, Emmanuel Levinas, wonderful. Yeah, talk more about that.
So he in his philosophy, he's talking about our experience of the other as almost in a way against our will, rather than talking about us passing through, sort of really unaware of the other. He talks about the other as sort of a challenge to us.
Yes. Well, and so, yeah, go ahead.
So he approaches it also by saying that it is in, how does he put it? He talks about how we objectify the other.
Yes.
The moment we try to, rather than looking at it from a point of like when I think of empathy, I think of a positive thing. Like you were trying to find common ground with the other. He flips it over. He puts it on his head. He says, "No, you're actually trying to reduce the other to yourself."
That's right.
Which is a form of violence. Which to me, I think the sort of the takeaway from that is, okay, it's not a bad thing to find empathy and connect with the other through yourself, but you also should be able to embrace the other for their otherness.
Yes. Well, and so this is this is huge because I think it's what's the philosopher's name? John Caputo. He talks about how the otherness of people is a way in which we encounter the real. It is their otherness that can speak to the inconsistencies in us. That the strangeness functions in a kind of what the Bible. This is a religious language, but it's the way I think. What the Bible calls a prophetic way. It speaks an unknown truth to us about ourselves and about the world. And Levinas would probably go along with that as a kind of a Jewish guy himself.
Right. But I'm not sure, like, I guess what I'm left off is, I'm not sure where. I mean, what's unknown, obviously, is the totality of the other. It can't be accessed
Right.
by us. But what's not unknown is sort of what we understand in that relationship, or we can come to understand that in that challenge, as Latos puts it. It seems to me like everything you're describing has little to do with notions of the supernatural or God or any. It's like, why? It's almost like if we want to describe our interaction with the other,
Mm-hmm.
or the limitations in which we sort of connect or fail to connect to ontology and to reality as it is.
Mm-hmm.
Those are probably the best philosophical and existential conversations one can have.
Right.
But what sense does it make to have those conversations in the context of Christianity, in the context of Islam, in the context of any kind of ideology with a religious baggage?
Yeah. Well, so I don't think all religions are equally capable of doing this.
I don't think so either. I can agree with you there.
And so I think that's part of my answer. When it comes to Christianity, I think is the original rebel, the original punk rock. It's the original, because what it does is the primary image of Christian faith is the crucified Messiah, and this idea kind of spits in the face of all contemporary notions of God. Paul calls
superpowers, right?
Yeah, calls it calls it foolishness to the wise. And I think as a religious system, Christianity has the ability to engage with this kind of idea, because what it's doing is saying these concepts of God, where you are using God as a justification for your own moral system, or justification for your oppression of the other, or justification for your particular worldview. Even I think what Christianity does is through the cross and through the cross's critique of the religions of the day, it allows us to talk about things of ultimate concern through a religious lens that is, I think it's perfectly capable of doing that by design.
So I think that's probably where we diverge, is that I think there can be, I mean, I think any text can be sort of interpreted, like we can do the verbal acrobatics to try to sort of frame it and put it in that context. But I think it's all the mainstream religions, I think, because one of their sort of connection to prior mythologies, and two, the way in which they were written and the kind of messages that one can derive if we do take a literalist approach. I don't think it's as easy as you're claiming.
I never said it was easy. And
okay. So I fair enough. Maybe I'm but I guess let me put it this way. I think the religious approach, which is actually far better fitted to talk about these existential issues and the other, is Buddhism. I think that much easier.
Yeah, I think the Buddhism has the capability.
Far more than, because yes, you're talking about the symbol of the cross as this sort of anti-establishment and sort of the original punk rock. And actually, it's funny you say that, because one of my professors, speaking of Kierkegaard and Nietzsche, I took 2 seminars. Yeah. I mean, we talked about the role of punk rock in connection to different philosophies over the period of time. So I think there's something to what you're saying. Obviously, someone like Nietzsche would look at Christianity as sort of the slave versus master relationship, And I think he probably would take a little bit of a different approach in interpretation of the role of Christianity in that context. But regardless, it seems to me like the symbol of the cross can actually very easily be used as an oppressive symbol.
Yeah, well, I think that's absolutely true. Yeah, keep going with that.
The talk about I mean, I know there's different beliefs of how hell is actually described in the Bible.
Sure.
But certain interpretations of hell can very easily be used as everything you're describing as. Certainly the Old Testament looks at God as a super being. At least
sometimes, right? So one of the things that we have in the prophetic tradition is a multiplicity of voices. And this is, and so what, for me, when it comes to faith is not assenting to a set of dogma. Faith is entering into a conversation. And I think that's a really important distinction, because a lot of people conceive of faith as there's a set of propositions that I need to accept, and that's what faith is. Right. Believing 40 impossible things before breakfast. That's what faith is. But I think faith at its best, and faith as it's, I think, embodied in both the prophetic and the rabbinic tradition, at least, is entering into a conversation. And so,
can you elaborate on that? Like, what results from the conversation, and I guess I'm trying to understand better what you mean by that process.
Yeah, well, I think this is a great way to talk about the fourth way we talk about God. So we talked about super being, hyper being, ground of being, and then the fourth way to talk about God is for Peter Rollins is God as event. And this will tie really closely into Derrida and what we were talking about earlier. So for him, God is for God as event is that which calls us to greater love, greater freedom, greater democracy, hospitality. It's that which stops us from reducing our experience of the world to one-dimensional materiality. And so the way we talk about this is like we were talking about with Derrida earlier, that every time we construct every time we talk about justice, we are making a construct of justice that always falls short of justice. But there's something in us that compels us to engage in the process of deconstructing and reconstructing. And so this would be God as event. It is in that space that God dwells, is what we might say. For this thing, faith would not be about accepting a set of beliefs. Faith would be about God and participation in God, which we can talk about more about that if you want to. That's a kind of a vague statement, but is a specific way of orienting yourself in the world. It's not so much a set of dogma.
So, I'm trying to sort of process what you're saying, because on one hand, everything you mentioned about justice, love, and sort of the mode in which we can operate into sort of, what's the word I'm looking for? Raise those experiences, and there's nothing about that a materialistic worldview or physicalist worldview undermines. I think it's perfectly possible to hold to both, but that aside, that's one flag to sort of plant down. Don't take this the wrong way, because I don't know. I'm not trying to be disrespectful when I say this in this way. I just don't know how to say it.
Yeah, no, you're fine.
I don't know that you're ultimately really saying anything concrete or anything that accessible. Because if you want to say that, if you're calling God a way to sort of, like you just said, reframe yourself in your relationship to reality and the other, and sort of being existentially aware of the importance of love, or the importance of meaning, or the importance of
So I want to just put this in here real quick. I would say that it is a existential commitment to meaning or to love. But keep going.
But what I don't understand is, I can do that without any kind of reverting to language that has a very problematic historical baggage, ideologies which have a very problematic historical baggage, and symbolisms which have a very historically problematic baggage. Like, yes, by all means, the world be a better place if we all engaged in existentialism and tackle these questions on a very real level, and really thought about what it means to interact with the other, how to best approach that, how can we derive meaning. Like, that's why I do philosophy, right? Because I value that conversation.
Right.
I value those questions. What I don't see the point in doing is taking those meaningful, important conversations and claim that they have a particular that religion, or sort of the term God, is doing anything to frame the conversation differently than philosophy in general. Like,
so I think, man, there's a couple of ways I can go with this. I'm trying to think what would be most helpful. So I think, so let's talk about this. What do you think, Cease, is the difference between theology and philosophy? What do you think is the demarcation between those two disciplines?
It's hard to verbalize, because I think obviously there's a crossovers, like with any,
right,
even with that, and even with philosophy and in some ways science. But the thing is, I sort of have this idealistic version of what I think philosophy should be,
mm-hmm.
which is I think is what actually probably science does better, which is try to sort of remove as many assumptions as we can make, to then arrive at the most reasonable beliefs given the available tools that we have.
Yeah, but that's not how we relate to the world. I mean, you know what I'm saying? So let's go back to the child example, right? So it's if I strip away all the assumptions, all the things that I bring, and just deal with the objective element of that, which is the child, that doesn't get us. How do I put this? What are we missing?
Are you trying to say that it doesn't get you to sort of the existential fulfillment of
maybe? It's really hard to put into words. I've never really gone down this path before, so I'm trying to conceive of even exactly what I'm talking about right now. So because
I would say I would disagree with that. I think I don't need to believe that my child is the most beautiful child in the world to feel to feel fully engaged existentially and feel the full range of meaning.
But
from
are
just
you
experiencing
justified? Are you justified? How?
Purely phenomenologically, in terms of phenomenology.
So it's the subjective experience that you're trying to remove, that you have to rely on for that.
No. I don't think. Okay. I don't think I'm. So there's different ways of looking at this.
Because let me say what I was understanding you saying about science earlier is that we're going to take away all the baggage that we bring as subjective, biased human beings, and we're going to focus on the brute facts and engage with those. Now,
yes, but there is a way in which values can also be. This sounds sort of counterintuitive, but I think there is a way where certain values are actually descriptions of states of being which can be observed as brute facts.
So actually, this is something I'd love to talk about. I know it's not what we were on or what we decided to talk about, but this is something, I think, I don't know if this is the exact model that you hold to, but like, sorry, I'm going to read what's on the screen because it seems to be important. I would completely disagree with that statement, but we can talk about that later. What was I saying? Oh yeah, so morality. I don't know if this is the system you subscribe to, but Sam Harris's Moral Landscape.
Yeah.
Okay, so
more or less
the way he talks about the greatest conceivable world versus the worst conceivable world and how we can move in that spectrum. I think that's a completely legitimate way to think about morality. I think it's a completely legitimate way to think about morality. And in fact, it's actually what Thomas Aquinas does. So what Thomas Aquinas does, most people know Thomas Aquinas for his unmoved mover argument. But I like his argument of, it's not really an argument, it's just a system. It's a way of thinking about the world, talking about good. So he thinks about goodness as a spectrum. You have the greatest conceivable good and the worst conceivable evil. And he says this spectrum is the same spectrum as existence and non-existence. It's the same spectrum. And he says that at the top of that spectrum is God himself. And at the bottom of that is hell, right? Or whatever you might call that. And so what I find very interesting is that if Thomas Aquinas heard what Sam Harris was doing, Thomas Aquinas would say, you're talking about God. That's what.
Yeah, I guess. How do I say this? I mean, I'm more or less on the Sam Harris view of things. I think mine is a little bit more expanded. Like my view is a little bit more because when Harris is, I think, is very underrated, and I think a lot of people misinterpret it.
Oh yeah,
but people really don't misinterpret all of what he says, because I think in his books he's trying to talk more with the general audience than go into very detail. But he knows what he's doing. Like he knows how to do that.
Yeah.
Just that he doesn't, because he's and so a lot of people give him a lot of shit that I think is unfair.
Yeah.
Now I do think that when he has debates and conversations, you can sort of see more of his depth of his understanding of these things. But again, I think where I'm at is I see it seems to me unnecessary to use the term God. Like I'm still at a place where I don't really know what is adding to the conversation by calling this thing God. What is it that you mean, and why it is that you seem to have this belief that if we move, yes, this is the thing I was going to say earlier. All experience is, in a sense, is subjective.
Yes.
But what the point of phenomenology is to try to get at a grounding of the subjective experience, so we can talk about our subjective experience in objective terms. So you and I can look at a bottle on the table, and I'm experiencing subjectively, you're experiencing subjectively, but we can communicate on what that phenomena is like, and we can come to some common ground in communication that we're actually objectively seeing something that we can say is the same thing.
Yeah. So let's talk about music in that way, right? So like I could listen to a song that speaks to me and touches my heart and opens up my imagination, and you could hear the exact same song and think it's garbage. Same phenomenon, but we experience it subjectively different. What I would say, go ahead.
Well, what I would say, so we can, it's true that we can listen to the same thing and not derive the same fulfillment from it. However, in the context of existentialism, I would say that it's the same thing. Like, we can have two different passions, right? And you can have one passion, I can have another passion. That can be subjectively different. Where the phenomena is the same is in the fulfillment that we derive from those passions that are different.
Yeah.
So you can like a music, I can like a different music. Subjectively we can experience it differently. But when I listen to something that connects with me, and when you listen to something that connects with you, even if those things are different on the surface, the experience we're having is actually very similar.
Yes. Yeah. Well, and I think yes, absolutely. Now, when it comes to our conversation about how this fits in with our language about God, what we're talking about when we talk about God, that the overarching thing that calls to us in our subjective experience is what we're when we're talking about God as ground of being. I think probably, yeah, that's what that would be. Is this? No, I don't know. It's hard to talk about, but that's kind of what we're talking about when we talk about God. But your previous observation about you don't know what using the word God adds to the conversation.
Yeah, because why don't just say this is what happens when we exist in reality? We encounter the other, we encounter ourselves within the world, and we're trying to sort of navigate the space to try to derive meaning and understanding. When you say that's God, I don't know what you're actually saying.
Yeah. So I think there's a couple reasons why we might want to do this. One of the reasons is this is an ongoing conversation. We're not the first people on the planet to start wrestling with questions of ultimate concern. And so as I talked about, theology is not accepting a set of propositions, entering into a conversation. And so if we're going to enter into that conversation and talk about these phenomenon with the people who've come before us, I think it can be helpful to engage their particular symbols and their particular images. Now, that doesn't mean that you have to accept those particular symbols and images, but I think it can be helpful to do so. The other reason that you might want to talk about God is I mean, this is kind of what we naturally do when we talk about things that call us to higher senses of reality, that call us to something bigger than ourselves. I mean, that's just what human beings have called this thing. And so I don't know if that helps you. Now let me add one more thing. I don't think you need that word. I don't think that word is particularly important. But because of the tradition that I find myself in and the conversation that has come before me, I find it, for me, particularly useful to talk about God, to talk about these things with that word, if that makes sense.
I think so. I think the problem from my end is that these traditions bring a baggage of, I mean, it's fine if you want to say that faith is not about a belief in a set of propositions.
Yes.
But it's hard for me to read the books and to observe what churches tell people, and observe the way in which these ideologies tend to function, and be very confident in this idea that one can be part of your tradition and ultimately arrive at your experience and framing of the situation. I mean,
yeah.
I would be very happy if most Christians saw the way that you do.
Yeah.
If it was more of a metaphorical, existentialist. I don't believe, like, it doesn't sound like you're saying that you don't necessarily believe in supernatural claims. Like, I don't know, for example, in this conversation, I have no idea what you think about the character of Christ and that story and what you think is metaphorical or literal. Like, I'm not sure in what what way you're a Christian at this point.
Yeah, so that's a great question. So in terms of supernatural stuff, for me that doesn't even really enter the conversation, as you noticed. Like I don't even I don't even get there. This might be a good time to plug a book. This is a book that I found very helpful in trying kind of articulating this. It's a great book. I actually have it here. I didn't write it. I'm not getting any money from this, but it's The Atheistic Theist: Why There Is No God and Why You Should Follow Him. It is a fantastic, it's a Christian book. And what it does is it talks about, it basically goes through the process of laying out some of the things that I've laid out here tonight. But it also kind of tries to give an example of how you engage with the tradition before you in a way that respects the methodology of the tradition, to critique the tradition itself.
So, that's fair. Two things real quick. One, I mean, if you have a book, feel free to plug it, because by all means.
I do not. I'm not a writer, not yet.
Okay. I think ultimately it comes to sort of a difference in intuition, where you think that there is value to the conversation in engaging with the conversation through these traditions. And from my perspective, my intuition is different, which is because all these traditions, whether it's Christianity, Islam, Buddhism, humanist philosophy, all these different frameworks try to discuss the same issues to different levels of success. My intuition is, fuck the traditions and the frameworks. It's, because I think there's so much baggage that is actually unhelpful in those traditions, and so much assumptions that people make when they hear the word God, when they hear the word faith. It's almost like, no, let's just start over.
Yeah,
like,
no, that is a problem. But
let's put all this aside.
So that's Nietzsche's point, right? When he talks about the death of God, we're going to make an overman. We're going to find something new. My critique of that is a little. I have a couple critiques of that, but I'll give one. It's mainly that's more optimistic than I am. That we can construct a new tradition from scratch in a way that will be helpful and speak to the human condition, and that will also be devoid of the problems that we have.
We can do the reason why. I mean, I understand what you're saying, and to some degree, I'm pessimistic towards the ability of people in general to really engage in these things on a deep level. Anyway, most people are. I forget which philosopher said this, but creatures of pure sensation. I have a friend of mine in the department who loves to use that because I think most people don't think about these things until they find themselves at some kind of existential crisis, and then they sort of hold on to
whatever they can.
And that's how they end up with these literalist views. But what I would say is that we have a tradition of the scientific method. We have a tradition of existentialism within philosophy. Which
I will point out, and this is not like an argument, but I want to point this out just as a point because we might have to visit this. Both of those traditions arise out of the Christian tradition, historically.
I think
Nietzsche is a reaction to Christianity. Kierkegaard is definitely within trying to understand the Christianity. Francis Bacon is a Christian, and so I mean, I'm not trying to say that because they arose in a Christian worldview that's the only way they could have arisen, or that they are absolutely tied to that. But it's
also not the only way. But it's also not. I mean, I can agree with you that obviously there have been influential Christians, scientists who were also Christian, and in some ways probably framed their curiosity about the world with their curiosity in trying to understand God or something of those sorts. But math came from or certain constructions of math from Islam.
That's right.
Certain interpretations of or attempts to talk about existentialism came from Buddhism. I think these are human questions which historically have been discussed within certain frameworks.
Right.
But I disagree. They don't arise from Christianity
Just
or from Islam.
They don't arise from them, but it is. I don't think it's historically irrelevant, or even philosophically irrelevant, because let's think about it this way. When we talk about trying to go back to and start over from scratch,
I'm not quite saying that, though. I'm not quite saying that.
Okay. If that is what you were saying, that gives me huge problems, because we have so much, we owe so much. We're standing on the shoulders of giants when it comes to our understanding of the world. And so I think Nietzsche's move to say we're going to discard old notions and build something new is it's just way more optimistic than I am. But
Nietzsche is talking about, he would say that that's actually not unprecedented. He would say that is actually the cycle that has been historically constant, where you have... Yeah.
So I think in that sense, I think this is also baked into what we've been talking about, right? That whenever we talk about whenever we attempt to talk about things of ultimate concern, we have to acknowledge that what we're doing is flawed and may need to be torn down.
Sure, I have no problem with that, but I guess what I would say is that we're not starting from scratch. We're looking at the tools of philosophy, right? Mm-hmm. We're looking at, and within existentialism, we can say, oh, here's a Christian existentialist, or here's an atheist existentialist. Yeah, we can look at sort of removed from the baggage of these terms, emotionally speaking. I think there can be some value in obviously looking at what roles ideology have played throughout history. But I'm just not convinced that in the need for the language to be what you think it should be in the context of the traditions. Like, I don't know.
Yeah, well, and I wouldn't say that it's a necessity, but I also don't think what you see is the harms, right? So what you're looking at is the harms that come along with some of this, some of the religious tradition, like the religious people who disown their gay children because of what is in a book, right? There's undeniable harms, and so what I'm hearing you say is, because these traditions have such a negative element to them, why not just discard them? And I think, at least within Christianity, there's an answer to that, which is it's by engaging. When I talk about the Christian tradition, I'm not necessarily talking about a set of propositions or facts, sure, but a way of being, and it is that way of being that is articulated through a varied medium, both written and oral, and all these things that even disagree with each other. That we can find a way to relate to the world. I love it. It's how do I put this? One of the things I've noticed recently. Have you noticed this? That a lot of movies that are coming out. Well, I guess nothing's coming out right now because of COVID. But a lot of movies that are coming out right now are remakes of old stories. Have you noticed that?
I mean, that's always been the case to me.
Right. And so I think what we're doing when we talk about God is that we are remaking these old stories. And it's to abandon these stories and start over. I just don't know if it's, like I said, I'm not optimistic about that process.
So let me try to frame it this way, because I agree with you that that's what we're doing. But my thing is, because I'm interested, what drives me is trying to understand how things really are, as much as I can understand how things really are, which I acknowledge is limited. And so I don't like, if we're looking at these stories or art as revealing something that may be psychologically true about our condition, sort of a kind of post hoc, like sort of we can, how to say this, sort of about more of a statement about ourselves than a statement about reality, then those stories and symbolism and art can be important and meaningful in that context. I don't think that the symbolism has the same value if what we're trying to do is get an understanding of ultimate reality and actually finding these questions to these, finding these answers to these really complex questions. I don't think that the symbolism does more than just reveal something true about us psychologically than something about the affairs of reality.
So I don't know about, I'm going to have to think about that for a second.
Sure.
But one of the things that I think might separate us in terms of our concerns is when it comes to belief, you seem to be concerned with the what of belief, like the content of belief, or even the why of belief, the why you might believe that. I'm less concerned with those questions, partially because I talked about how, something that psychology has taught us is a lot of the things that we don't even know what we believe. And because of that, I'm less concerned with the what of belief. I'm more concerned with how belief functions.
I'm concerned with all of it. I would say I'm concerned with all of it.
I am concerned with all of it in certain contexts, right? So the what of belief becomes really important when my anesthesiologist is trying to get the dosage. My mom's an anesthesiologist. And so when she's trying to get the dosage right to make sure somebody goes under and comes back up, the what is really important, right? And the methodology of arriving on that what, super important. When it comes to my subjective experience of the worth of my child and the meaning that gives me in my life, the what isn't so important. It's more how that functions. And so I would say the context of what you're doing really does shape the criterion that you're looking at for legitimacy.
So I think we've that right there. I think we've hit the core of our disagreement. Mm-hmm. Because I don't think that, for me, the methodology to how to separate the real from the imagined remains the same throughout all the context. Like, I don't think I don't apply a different methodology in my mind when I'm trying to understand physics. Mm-hmm. And when I'm trying to understand existentialism.
Again, so I maybe I didn't speak very clearly. So I would say that you would use the same methodology to do that, but when you're relating to your kid, you don't do that.
So I disagree with that. That's what I'm saying. Is that in my, there's nothing about my understanding of my subjective experience within the world and phenomenology and the meaning derived from my relationships that needs to be addressed without the methodology of science, for example. I don't think that's.
Yes, I would agree with that. But where I would push back on you in terms of this is I would disagree that people do that all the time. So that people are engaged in that process. I think the methodology can be applied and is helpful in all contexts.
Oh, I don't think people use. So I actually agree with you. I don't think people use the methodology in general.
Very often. Right. Like, so my wife, she's a biologist, right? And so she, when she would work in the cancer research lab, she's raising the kids now, but when she would work in the cancer research lab, the stuff you have to do proper methodology, nobody has time for that. Like, that's not how we live, to do proper methodological science. We just don't live like that. We hold all sorts of beliefs for terrible reasons.
But I think it's a real problem.
Okay, so I think it depends, right? I don't know. I don't think it's a problem unless how the belief is functioning is a problem.
Okay, so yeah, I completely disagree with that, because I think, yes, part of it is the consequences of the belief itself, but the justifications for those beliefs, I think, matter greatly.
How?
Well, because if you believe something for the wrong reasons, that is epistemically unjustified. That leaves you open to making all kinds of errors in the way you believe. And I mean, at best, an irrational belief can just be irrational. And at worst, a lack of focus on the methodology can lead people to believe very dangerous things. We want to be connected to reality.
Don't get me wrong. I'm not saying that the methodology is not important. What I'm saying is, when it comes to the questions that interest me, when we're talking about how human beings relate to one another, how do we get this thing, is how the belief functions. I think that's the existential question, is how the belief functions. It's about, you are experiencing the brute fact of reality, and there's a subjective experience that arises within you, and then you act on these things. But when you talk about, let's see, when you talk about the, let's talk about the God belief for a second. So when somebody believes in God, they can believe in God for terrible reasons. Maybe it's because they grew up in a religious home, and if they didn't believe God, they'd be sent to the orphanage, right? That's a terrible reason. And I think we can talk about methodology, and we can talk about how we get to these things. But when I'm talking about continental philosophy, and I'm talking about how humans relate to one another and how we can move through life together, let's talk about methodology. Let's do all of that. But at the end of the day, for me, the question is less methodological, partially because of what we've already talked about with constructions, right? So even the methodology itself is a construction. I think science is a pretty dadgum good, has a pretty dadgum good track record, is what I'll say. But it's a construction. And so when we relate to one another, I'm much more interested. Not that methodology isn't important, but I am much more interested in how people's belief functions, because I don't expect them to do methodologically sound science for everything that they do and think. I don't think that's how humans function.
But if we're trying to get tentatively speaking at the truth of things, even or at the very least the appearance of what seems like, okay, yes, I don't think we have full access to ontology, but the ontology can be implied by the condition we find ourselves in with the tools that we have. I think it's when you say the science is a construction, it depends on what you mean by that. I think it can be very misleading.
Right. It can,
because it's reality that's informing whether or not the theories hold water or they don't. It's not that we just construct these things, and because otherwise science wouldn't need to evolve, because we would already have constructed things that seem to work, and then they would just stay stagnant and they would function, because they
Right.
So I don't. We can say that yes, we constructed the scientific method in a sense, but it's a result of trial and error in the context of a larger reality in which we're a part of. So for me,
Right.
when you say that, well, the methodology doesn't really matter as much, what matters is more about how humans are coming together.
I'm not saying that it matters more. I would say that that's what I'm concerned with, because I can't, when it comes to people's lives and how they live, like I said, my wife, she's done her biology. I know the kind of rigors that science takes to work, and that's not how people function. That's just if we can just open our eyes and see that that's just not how people work normally. And so I'm
Sure.
Go ahead.
No, I actually agree with you, but don't you think that if people were more accustomed to do that even a little bit, like I'm not saying that for every part of our life we operate like a philosopher, because a lot of people don't have that kind of mindset.
Philosophy or science?
Oh, I think all of it.
Okay.
I think I think there's an overlap there, but I will say that how do I say this? Because it depends on the kind of conversation we're trying to have as well.
That's exactly right. It's you're right. It's based on context.
But
what we're talking about.
But if we are concerned, if we're interested by existentialism, to some extent, we're interested in trying to actually get the answers of what is really going on and why what is the truth of these things.
Yes, as far as we can. Yeah.
As far as we can, and I acknowledge that we're not ever going to reach that. The final answer. It's not going to happen. But so that's where I think it's, to me, the conversation about existentialism is more meaningful when we have a methodology that can actually provide us with answers, at least to a certain degree, than purely just observing what people are doing, sort of on a more removed level. Which I'm not saying which is what you're doing, but
yeah. So I hope I haven't misconstrued my position. I may have. It's not that I don't think that methodology is good, or that methodology is important, or even that's not the methodology that we should use. But the how of belief is, for me, in my own personal experience, a much more fruitful frame to take when you're trying to talk about things. So, like, for instance, can
you clarify the how of belief in the context of a child?
Yeah.
Because maybe I'm just not clear.
The how of belief in that is you relate to your child, and let's disregard the what of belief in that for a second. So if I see that you neglect and beat your child, I don't care if you say you love him. Don't care, right?
Sure.
But if you say, yeah, my kid's kind of a pain, but you love and care for them, I don't care that you think your kid's kind of a pain. You know what I mean? And so the content, it's how a certain belief is functioning in that system. So when we talk about fundamentalism, for example, I think oftentimes atheists treat fundamentalism as a problem, but I actually think fundamentalism is a solution to a problem. So what you have here is this human, very, very human drive for certainty. One of my favorite theological books is Peter Enns' The Sin of Certainty. And it's a great book if you guys are interested in looking at that. But there's this need to feel secure and safe, and my way is right, and I can feel justified, and I can have a solid rooting. And that's how their belief is functioning. It is a antidote to a problem. And I think by addressing how it's functioning and looking at the problem that it's addressing, that we can kind of actually get at what we would perceive as a problem.
But it actually seems to me that what you're doing there is applying the method that I'm talking about.
Right. Like I said, I don't think that it's not a good method, or even the method we should, a methodology that we should use. But I'm less concerned with people's methodology than I am with how their belief functions.
But when you distinguish between the guy that says they love their child and then beats them,
yeah,
and the guy who doesn't beat the child but says, like, is more honest about what they're actually feeling, you're not interested in their methodology, but you're applying the methodology that I'm referring to.
Yeah, absolutely.
Distinguish between what's just being claimed is the case and what can actually be observed to be the case.
Yeah, I definitely wouldn't have any issue with that.
Okay. Because that to me is ultimately the issue, is that we can have all the symbolisms we want, but unless we can apply the methodology that can differentiate between the imagined and the actual, I don't know that we're making that in understanding humanity, in understanding these questions, that we can make much progress without that methodology.
Yeah, well, and I think there's definitely something to that. I think this idea that how do I put this? This is really difficult to get into words.
You're always welcome to come back. I think this is a really good conversation. I would love to have you back and go into these things in more detail.
Yeah. So when we talk about this might be a good way to go back. So I asked you earlier what the distinction is between philosophy and theology. And I think for me, this is how I operate, and this is not like a textbook definition or anything, but this is how I operate. Something is theological when it has what we've talked about as the objective element, the thing itself, the subjective element, and the transformative element.
I think theology is encompassed within philosophy. I think it's a branch of philosophy.
I don't think I would disagree with that. We might push it to its limits in some cases, but I don't think I would disagree with that. And so I think it's these things that make it theology rather than philosophy. And so I think theology, by definition, like I've already talked about, is art. And so the objective element, let's say,
but there are branches of philosophy that have those exact same concerns and views.
Right, but I would call those theology. Because what they're dealing with is,
it seems a little bit of an issue of semantics at this point.
Right. Well, and so here's what I mean. So how do I put this? When we hit the objective element, the objective element can be something like an event or a thing or a person. To put it in the context of religious experience, let's talk the crucifixion of Jesus. Okay, this event that happens, and then you have the subjective experience of that, which might be that God is not who I thought he was, or that the world is more complicated than I thought it was, or any of these sort of things. And it's this last part, the transformative aspect, that calls us to commit to a new way of being that opens up because of the connection between the objective and the subjective. And I think that's the realm where the symbolic and the imagined lie. And I don't think really you can get away from that in any meaningful sense.
Say the last part again. Say the last part again. I want to make sure.
I don't know if I can. I'm one of these people who think stream of conscious. So let me try and go back. This idea, I'll probably screw it up, that it is that transformative aspect is the one that is the possibility that you commit yourself to, that has been opened up by the interaction of the objective and the subjective. And it's in the interaction of the objective and the subjective that the imagined and symbolic exist and lie. And I don't think that we can get rid of those things and still talk about relating to the world.
Okay. That is definitely, because I could go on like another hour just on that.
Yeah.
Let's do this, because I think we're about to hit the 2-hour mark almost.
Yeah.
I would love to have you back soon.
Sure.
And I know Mike said he wanted to say something towards the end. I'll see if anybody has more questions that's listening. I'll post this comment real quick that was posted. There's an enormous disagreement on the central idea of religion, God. Everyone has their own view of this concept. Is there any other branch of human inquiry where the central idea is so uncertain?
Yeah. So I think that's a great question, right? And this is one of the issues that comes up in the prophetic tradition. So, like, when it comes to God, he's in the prophetic tradition, he's so full of meaning that they have all these different names for him, right? There's so many different names for God. And one of the ways to talk about something so meaningful is to rob it of its meaning by naming it in so many different ways. And so I think the prophetic tradition of negating the idea of God as object through its pursuit of meaning in these ways kind of answers that a little bit. That the reason people have so many different ideas of God is because they're still trying to grasp God as object. They're still trying to hold on to that idea. This is unpacked in the Atheistic Theist. This idea, if y'all want to, if
for sure,
viewers are interested in looking at that.
Great. I think we've only just hit the surface. There's a lot more that I definitely want to talk to you about. I really want to, next time you're on, there's two things I'm fascinated by. One, I want to try to understand, since this is your sort of, how would I say this? Perspective. It seems much more an ambiguous one, and a more metaphorical one. I'm curious to see how it is that then you interpret the Christian tradition in a way that you derive meaning from it. So I'd be curious to see.
It's a great question, and I'd love to talk about that.
So I would like to see, like, for example, like I said earlier, Jesus and the idea of the resurrection and all those things, how that fits into your approach.
Yeah,
that I think is a unique and interesting one. And also, I really want to discuss this relationship between the imagined, symbolic, and real.
Yeah.
Because you seem to think that there is a space in which these things actually exist, almost like platonically in a sense.
Maybe I don't know. We
yeah.
have to talk more about that to really tease that out.
And I have a very different perspective on that.
Yeah.
And I think that would be an interesting conversation to have. But Mike, is there anything that you wanted to address here?
No, I mean, we hit the 2-hour thing. I think we could just kind of start our own conversation next time about it. It's not really as related, and you guys went super in depth on a lot there. So I'll just leave it there, and we'll do kind of a one-on-one with me and Bryan, where we could get into that, and then maybe you guys finish up the conversation for that time, or maybe a part 3. I don't know, however you want to do it. We have a lot of different people try to come back, like Dr. DeLockery's come back a couple times. I know David Gonzalez will probably come back again, which, by the way, I have a debate with him on the 29th on the Atheist Roundtable, so go check that out. The topic is, does the Christian God exist? I knew I could entice him by being the one atheist that will go, hey, I'll take the affirmative of no, because it seems that that's not a position that a lot of atheists are willing to take.
Fun fact, I would actually, in terms of, we've talked about God as object. If you want to go there, I would also take the affirmative of no on that position, right?
And so the end, that's another reason why is like, there's a lot that I'd want to dedicate a conversation with you about the Genesis thing, because I think there's still more I need to understand from your perspective before I could even attack.
If you want to do that off air, I would love to. I'd be willing to do that too.
Yeah, I'm gonna go grab some food. I'm starving.
Sure,
but definitely we'll schedule that for the next appearance, and then
I definitely, I'm still trying to, and I'll watch this over, but I definitely want to talk to you again, because I'm still trying to sort of grasp at what it is that. If God is not an object or a being or an entity, what it is that you actually mean? Because it's you've talked about a sort of a relationship to reality, and I'm still sort of unclear.
Yeah, so I'll give you just like this might be a teaser for next time, but I would say God is the mystery that we experience in engaging in the act of love itself, and so we can talk about what that means and how we can unpack that and know that next time. That sounds like a fun conversation. Thanks so much for coming. And I really enjoyed this conversation. It's always interesting to hear a perspective that I haven't. Anytime that I can have a conversation about religion that's new, it's, because I don't get all of that. Usually it's the same sort of terrible arguments that don't go anywhere.
Yeah, I really enjoyed it because it was it was different. The spots that Cease would say, like, I wish kind of more Christians had this perspective. I might be a little less on that side to say, because I'm thinking more like, I guess this is maybe will give you a perspective of where I'll be coming from in our conversation, is that I'm the metaphor thing, or even taking it as such, I don't want to say it's like an excuse by any means, but it seems that it devalues the word. That, like, if somebody was in trouble and I had to call them to tell them, I don't think I would metaphorically explain to them that their house is on fire and that they need to figure that out through my metaphors, right? And so
sure.
There's a lot in that you would have to explain to me where I'm shooting over the top of kind of what you're saying. That makes sense.
To try to steal many, I just want to make sure, because I want to see if I've actually understood you correctly in this conversation. You would say that Mike framing of this is still looking at God as an object. Yes, this is exactly what I would say.
Yeah, and I think that's the part I'm saying that I might be shooting over the top of you in a sense where we'll have to try to meet in the middle somewhere.
And so what I would say is, even in the Bible itself, you can see this interplay between people who think of God as object and who think of God as that thing which calls us to be more. And that it's complicated. It really is. I I know we're already like over the 2-hour mark. So
there's no real like limit on it. It's really my stomach is the barrier. But but I would ask though, I guess, is like, would you think it kind of how I might view things like as a nominalist? I'm going to, reject these kind of concepts as like essences and things. Like, do you think that those are going to be inherently valuable to your framework in a way, like where?
What do you mean by those? I'm not.
So like, because when you say object or not, like now it seems that we could get into conversations about abstract concepts and things like that, and what you're relating, like how you're denoting this God thing outside of the object. I've gotten a gist of it from the conversation, to the best of my understanding, at least I think. But I would be curious to know if like me as a nominalist is gonna just inherently get in the way of me ever understanding that because of that perspective of understanding. Like,
I think you probably would, because where I come from, it is all description is inadequate, and so when we're talking about nominalism, these, rather than what's the opposite of nominalism? It's escaping my brain. What's the opposite of nominalism?
Well, I mean, you could just say Platonists or
so
realists about numbers, or however you'd want to phrase it, I guess.
But I don't think nominalists necessarily believe that the description has to fully capture the phenomena. I'm not sure that that's the case.
Yeah, no, that would be right. So I think it would probably be okay. I think where we might run into issue is like when you're talking about how do you say like you talk about metaphor as a weakness, right? So you would talk about metaphor as a weakness, and I would say there are things that are not that metaphor is actually the best way to understand it, and so that's probably where we would end up going in that conversation, I think.
Sure.
And so I think that the idea that we can come up with nice, pretty, symbolic representations of complex ideas is, I think that falls apart when you push on it hard enough.
You're definitely a continental.
Yeah.
But I'm curious, before we get going, how familiar are you with Wittgenstein, and on the other end of the spectrum, Deleuze? So
I'm not familiar with Deleuze very much at all, but I am relatively familiar with Wittgenstein, Hegel, those kind of guys.
Okay.
But no, I don't
curious
at all.
Gotcha. Okay.
Yeah.
Cool.
So again, Bryan, thank you for coming on. That was it was awesome. I loved watching you guys kind of light up in the philosophical realm of certain topics and things. That's good for. I don't know if I expected that as much. I didn't know more into doctrine or where we'd kind of go, and so that was interesting.
One of the things I'd love to discuss is like if you guys are interested in it, maybe not tonight, but in future conversations, is a lot of the things biblically that I can see as, these people take these stories as these kind of non-contradictory edicts from God, and I think it's demonstrably false, and I can talk to you guys about how I do it. Like, people talk about contradictions all the time. I never hear anybody bring up my favorite, which is the census that David takes in Samuel versus the census that David takes in First Chronicles, because those are two separate histories.
Yeah, if you get anything about a census, it's going to be about Luke and under Quinarius and Caesar.
Yeah, well, so and people will be like, oh, well, it's just a couple numbers off. Well, in this one, it's in Samuel, it is God was angry against David, and he incited David to number the people of Israel. In Chronicles, which is a later history, and Satan rose up and incited David to number the people of Israel. That's my favorite one.
Yeah,
and nobody ever brings that up.
I'm my thing with the contradictions that I like to bring up is like I think always people think I'm they don't see the intent of why I'm pointing them out. It's never to say this makes this false. It's like a twofold of, okay, which this cast question of what do I trust now? Like, if this is wrong, like, or if this is kind of the same thing with a metaphor. It's like, well, if this can be a metaphor, then can't just God and be backed into a metaphor? And then at that point, I'm not reading the same book that you're reading. And so the other side of that, the reason why I kind of point these out is to show, or at least to try to paint the picture of how we know, like, say Mark is first, or like Mark in priority, or things like. So I'm going to use like Mark 6 and Matthew 14 in comparison to show, like, well, hey, Matthew's changing this to tetrarch, not to say, okay, they contradict each other because Mark views Herod Antipas as a king, and Matthew is correcting that to tetrarch, what we know in antiquity. I'm not saying, oh, that proves the Bible false, or anything, or to say that it shouldn't have something. It's just to say, like, let's use these contradictions to build a picture, to see how the priority fits, and then we can look at things like Q source or things like, and see, just kind of analyze it or do an internal critique. It's never to say this is false. It's always for me to kind of do an internal critique on the person that at least the follower of the religion, like where they, if any of that bothers them, and then how they reconcile it, I guess.
Yeah. So it's a thoroughly human book, and any critical eye will catch this, and they're not hiding the ball. Like, some people think that these were dictated by God out of heaven, but I mean, they talk about, we did research, we compiled sources, we did all these things. So there's a lot of interesting stuff in there.
Yeah, sure. 100%.
We definitely have a lot of conversation left to have. That will be interesting.
Yeah,
I appreciate you coming again.
Absolutely. Thanks, guys.
Yeah, thank you guys. All right.